And now we're going to turn to Daf Samach Tes Amid Beis. And at this point, Rabbah is going to formulate rules. And what's the klal? V'chol she'ilu biyachid nidche is b'tzibur avdi. Now, I should add the word betuma here. Oh yeah, betuma. Says Rabbah, here's the klal. If a person becomes tummy, contracts a certain kind of tumah, whatever it might be. Let's say he's a tummy mess. If he's a yachid, and as a yachid, we tell him, wait another month. The Torah gave us a parsha of Hashlam, of Tashlumin, of Pesach Sheni. Then in such a case, where the yachid is sent to Pesach Sheni, the tzibur, if rov tzibur atmeim, is avdi b'tumah. They do not have Pesach Sheni. We're not docha the entire tzibur to Pesach Sheni. And we're going to allow them to bring the Pesach on the 14th, b'tumah. So it's fascinating. When a yachid is pushed off to Pesach Sheni because of tumah, the tzibur is not pushed off to Pesach Sheni, and they will bring the Pesach b'moed on the 14th, b'tumah. And at this point, Rabbah continues. Now, I'm not sure if Rabbah is now giving a second klal, another new principle, or he's explaining the first principle. And he says the following. Kol milsa di'isa b'tzibur, any chiyuv that's incumbent upon the tzibur, and they have to do whatever they have to do in order to facilitate their ability to bring the Korban Pesach, then Isa b'yachid. Then if the tzibur would have to do what they have to do in order to prepare themselves for the Pesach, the yachid, if he's in that same situation, also has to do what he has to do in order to prepare himself for the Pesach. But kol milsa the less of it tzibur, less of b'yachid. If the tzibur themselves are not obligated to do X, whatever it is, to be machshir themselves, is less of b'yachid, then the yachid is not obligated either. We're seeing over and over again that there's a comparison and a parallel between the yachid and the tzibur. So therefore, since the mitzvah of Pesach was given to all of Klal Yisrael together, therefore, whatever applies to the yachid applies to the tzibur and vice versa. They're all one. The Torah gave the mitzvahs to Ki'ish echad b'lev echad. Kol Yisrael b'yachid. Okay. Therefore, Arelus. Now let's take actual cases and see how we apply these principles. What happens in the case of Arelus? The Ikuli tzibur Arelim ninhu. In the case of the tzibur Arelim, again, it's hard to imagine, but the entire tzibur, or most of the tzibur Arelim, we're not going to tell them, you know what? It's mutter for you to bring the Korban Pesach. The Torah was only matir, bringing the Korban Pesach with tzibur of tzibur tmeim, but not Arelim. So in the case of Arelim, kula tzibur Arelim, Amrina lahu, we're going to tell the tzibur, kumu mahola nafshaychu ve'avidu pischa. We're going to require that the entire tzibur undergo milah, each individual as part of the tzibur, and bring the Korban Pesach, because this psul of Arelus is not matir the tzibur to bring the Korban Pesach as Arelim. Therefore, again, in the light of these klolim and the analogy between the yachid and the tzibur, yachid nami. If he's an Arel, Amrina lekum mahol the avid pischa. Go ahead and circumcise yourself and bring the Korban Pesach. So, for example, we're talking about Erev Pesach on a weekday. So there's no issue of Chil Shabbos in this meal. Go ahead and be mal yourself, and you're obligated to do so. After all, if the tzibur were all arelim, we would obligate them, each and every one of them, to undergo milah. So too, you have the same status. And if you fail to do so, he doesn't do that, is anush kares. That's in the case of arelim. Now let's apply these same principles in the case of tumah. Tumah, let's say somebody contracted tumas mes. Ikula tzibura tmeim ninu. If let's say rovat tzibur or tmeim mesim lo madinan alayu, we don't have to do hazah, but rather avdi b'tela avdi b'tumah. They can bring the korban b'tumah on the 14th. Is yochid nami potur? He doesn't have to do tumah. He doesn't have to do hazah and tara. And such hazah, therefore, will not override the Shabbos. So we were racking our brains to try to figure out the logic of Rabby Eliezer. Why isn't hazah, which is only a shvus, docha Shabbos? And the answer is because when we're dealing with tamei mes, we're going to apply the principle of kol milsa the lesser b'tzibur lesser b'yachid, which means that if the tzibur does not have to undergo tahara in order to facilitate their ability to bring the Korban Pesach, the yachid doesn't have to undergo tahara. And if the yachid doesn't have to undergo tahara, then he's in a state where he's parted from the mitzvah, and therefore hazah is not going to override the Shabbos, because hazah cannot be override the Shabbos when the tara is not necessary. And here the tara is not necessary. He's parted from hazah and tara. So this means that we're not going to shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of a tamei, because if rovat tzibur were tmeim, they could bring the korban b'tumah. They don't have to undergo tara, and therefore the yachid doesn't have to undergo tara. He's not considered chayav in tara, and therefore we're not going to override the Shabbos, and we're not going to do a hazah. Even though, again, the paradox, my friends, is that if we would have done the hazah, then he could eat from the Korban Pesach. But right now he's in a state of tumah, asher usham, and we're going to compare the yachid to the tzibur. Therefore, he's parted from being mitayr himself. At the end of the day, we'll push him off to Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara now objects to this klal of kol milsa the lesser b'tzibur lesser b'yachid. Amalei Rafuna B'rei Rabbi Yeshua Rava Farei Pesach Sheni the lesser b'tzibur v'isa b'yachid. The entire entity of Pesach Sheni is going to undermine your klal. Why? Because Pesach Sheni has no relation to the tzibur. There's never ever a situation where we doche the tzibur to Pesach Sheni. And this, my friends, is based on a sugya that we learned back on Daf Samach Zayin, that if, let's say, for example, Rov Tmeim, let's say Rov of the tzibur are Zavim to Maziva, they don't do the Pesach at all, because there's no such thing as being docha the tzibur to Pesach Sheni, and yet a yachid has Pesach Sheni. Now, according to Rabbah, the way he formulates his klal, that all the dinim of Pesach, and whether you're chayav or not, are derived from tzibur, then why don't you just say that if the tzibur is not chayav in Pesach Sheni, and they can never be so, and the yachid shouldn't be chayav in Pesach Sheni, and that's impossible. And here we see that the yachid is different than the tzibur. Amalei shani hasam. So the Rabbah responds in defense of Rabbah that this is different. Pesach Sheni. The Ovidle Tzibura Berisha. The reason why we're not going to push off the Tzibur to Pesach Sheni is because they can bring the Korban B'tumah on Pesach Rishon. And what is the whole entity and essence of Pesach Sheni? It's not an independent chiyuv that on the 14th of Iyar you have to bring the Korban Pesach, but rather it's another opportunity to fulfill the chiyuv of Pesach. So we consider it as if the tzibur is chayav, and really they'd be chayav in Pesach Sheni, except that the Torah allows them to bring the korban of Pesach Rishon. Therefore, a yachid is also chayav in Pesach Sheni. But in a case where the tzibur doesn't do Pesach Rishon, let's say, for example, Rov Azavim, as we said before, then Enochinami, the yachid, who's tameh, in such a case, is not pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Why? Because the tzibur is not pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So again, in the case where Rov HaTzibur Tmeim, they become chayav and they indeed fulfill their mitzvah. The yachid, therefore, is going to be pushed off if he has tumah to Pesach Sheni. But in case where Rov HaTzibur are zavim, and there is no kiyum of Korban Pesach at all, not on Pesach Rishon, not on Pesach Sheni, then in such a case, the yachid is not going to be obligated in the mitzvah of Korban Pesach when he's a Tomei Mes. Meisvei, the Gemara has a kash on Rabbah from the following brisa. Yochel shelo yeh onish kares ela mishayatar or shelo hoya b'derech rechoka. Somebody who's very close, or somebody who's tar and he didn't bring his korban. But I might think that Orel utamei sheretz uchar kol atmeim, they could be masaking themselves and they can do a circumcision or a tara, and therefore they could become roy lechos pesach. Minayin, how do you know that if they don't do so, echayiv kares? Talmud Lom in the pasuk says the haish. I'll read the whole pasuk. Asher utar ubederech lo hoya v'chadal lasos pesach v'nichusa nefesh yime'amel. He's tar. He's not b'derech rechoka. He can be makayim the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. And from the fact that the Torah adds the extra word veha'ish, it's coming to include these who have the ability to be misaking themselves, so that by Erev they can already be fine and perfect for the Korban Pesach. If they fail to be misaking themselves, they're chayav kares. Now let's read this brisa carefully. Me the kamahadra atame atmei sheretz. For the fact that Tana, this brisa, is looking for the case of Tomei Sheretz, to derive from a ribui of the word Veha'ish, that in such a case he's chayav kares because he could be mitayim himself. We have to derive the conclusion that kasavar ain't shoftin vizarkin al Tomei Sheretz. That if a person is Tomei, whether it's Tomei Sheretz or Tomei Mes, and it's the seventh day of his tara, in the case of Tomei Mes, we're not going to be Zorek, Shochet and Zorek the Pesach for such a person. And I'll prove it to you. They eat Shochet and Zorek al Tmei Sheretz. If you do Shchita and Zrika for Tmei Sheretz, even before he goes to the mikvah, is Lama Leila Dure Ale. Why does the Tana, this brisa, have to stretch his arm out to a drasha of the Ish, to teach you that from this ribui, he's going to be chayav if he doesn't misakin himself, and he's going to be nenash with an onish kares. Hainu tar. I don't get it. His status is exactly the same as the tar, because we're going to bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf. He can't enter into the Azara himself personally because he's tameh, but he'll send a shliach who'll be makar of the Korban Pesach. So he has in essence, he has the same identical status as a tar. And we're going to bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf. And he went to mikvah on the 14th of Nisan. And when it comes to the 15th, it's time to eat the Korban Pesach. He already harif shemesh, and he'll eat the Korban Pesach. So why does the brisa feel compelled to derive the halacha of a Tmei Sheretz from an extra pasuk? I don't get it. If you're going to tell me that Shoftim V'Zarkin al Tmei Sheretz, his status is identical with that of a tar, and you don't need a pasuk Ladure Ale to prove that he's also chayav kares like a tar. Obviously, he's chayav kares. He's gonna bring the Korban Pesach, although he himself doesn't enter into the Azor. We'll bring it on his behalf, and by nighttime, he's going to sit down with us at the Seder table. He's going to eat the Korban Pesach, and if he doesn't do so, He's chayiv cards like a tar who doesn't do so. Alma, we have to prove from this brisa, af al gav de lo chazi, even though the tame right now in his present state is not roy, he cannot be makriv the Korban Pesach. He wasn't retired from his tumah, but nevertheless, Ram Yechiyuv Ve'aleh, we have a chiyuv Korban Pesach that's incumbent upon him. He has to go ahead and do whatever he has to do. He has to be masakin himself. He has to go to mikvah, and he has to circumcise himself in order that he should be makriv the korban. And in the meantime, we'll bring the korban through a shliach, and he by erev he'll be tar after Erev Shemesh, and he'll eat it from the Korban Pesach. The afal gav the lesser b'tzibur. If the entire tzibur are tmei mesim, then there would be no chiyuv for the tzibur to be mitayr themselves, because they can bring the korban b'tumah. So you see that afal gav the lesser b'tzibur isa b'yachid. Even though the tzibur are not chayav to be mitayr themselves if they were tmei mesim or if they were tmei sheretz, nevertheless the yachid is obligated to be mitayr himself, and if he doesn't do so, he's chayav karis. It's against Rabbah, who says that kol milsa the lesser b'tzibur, lesser b'yachid. And then, in effect, we're going back to the square one, and we don't understand the shita of Rabby Eliezer, why hazah is not dochas Shabbos. We said hazah is not dochas Shabbos, according to Rabby Eliezer, because he's not considered in the parsha. And we're going to say, why not? Because since it's less of a tzibur, but you see that even if it's less of a tzibur, it's still isa b'yachid. Elama Rava says, I have another answer to explain Rabby Eliezer's shita. Kasav Rabby Eliezer shochtim v'zarkin al tmei sheretz v'adin litmei mes b'shvi shalom. In other words, we're going to go through the entire process of shchita and zrika of the Korban Pesach on behalf of Tomei Mes or a Tomei Sheretz on the seventh day. And right now it's before Tvila, it's before Hazah. It's Hazah Lamai. Why do we need to be Mazeh for such a person? And the only possible answer is Liachila. So that now, Ba'erev, he could eat the Korban Pesach. Achilas Pesachim lo ma'akva. There are two different dinim over here. There's one din of Hakrovas HaPesach, the Yotze, the mitzvah of Hakrova. And even if he's not mitayr himself by Erev and eat from the Korban Pesach, nevertheless he fulfills his chiyuv of Korban Pesach when they brought the Korban on the Mizbeach. Is Memel is no reason to be mater azah on Erev Pesach, because when Erev Pesach coincides with Shabbos, because in any event he will be makayim the mitzvah of Hakrovas HaPesach. And even if in the worst case scenario he remains tummy and he can't eat from the Korban Pesach, that's not going to be ma'akiv him from fulfilling his chovas Korban Pesach by being makrid on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara doesn't like this. Amalei Rav Ado bar Aval Rava in Kain Mimta Pesach Nishchat Shaloli Ochot. If you're telling me that even if he remains tummy, we're going to bring the korban on his behalf, and he's not going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach at night. Well, if you remember, we had learned back on Daf Samach Aleph that Pesach in this situation is possible because there's no ochlim. So Rabbi says, Alam Chachila conceptually says, what shaloli ochlav? That means that they shechted a Korban Pesach on behalf of a chol or a zakin delo chazi. He cannot eat it because he's too weak. He cannot do anything in his power to be masakin himself. Aval high, but this tamei mitzay chazi, he can eat the Korban Pesach if he's tovel and he's mitayr himself. Tikuni hu delo miskan. Okay, he wasn't masakin himself from his tumah, and before he's not allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach. But as far as his status is concerned, he's mitzay chazi. There is a possibility of his eating the Korban Pesach. So therefore, it's considered that we shechted for the ochlim. Rabbi Akiva formulates at the end of our Mishnah the following klal, and we'll review it. Kol melacha she'ef shalas tos b'erev Shabbos ein dochas haShabbos shchita she'ef shalas tos b'erev Shabbos dochas haShabbos. On Rabbi Yehuda Rav halacha k'Rabbi Akiva u'tanan nami. We have a parallel Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Gabi Mila. Anything that's necessary for the Milah, when the 8th day of the baby's, since the baby's birth is on Shabbos, is then will be docha. But Shabbos, if, let's say, for example, you want to bring the knife through Rishus Harabim, and you could have done it on Erev Shabbos, ain't it dochas Shabbos. But the meal itself, Shabbos, because the Zman is the Yom HaShmini is Shabbos, is dochas Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Rav, the same tradition of Rabbi Yehuda Rav, halachic Rabbi Akiva. So why do we have to find that in two places Rabbi Yehuda Rav feels compelled to repeat himself, that we pass like Rabbi Akiva when they're two identical halachas? That just like with regard to Korban Pesach, we're going to allow the shechita because that couldn't be done before the 14th of Nisan, which is Shabbos. But that which could have been done earlier will not override the Shabbos. And the same thing applies to Milah. The Gemara says, we need both. Each one stands on its own and cannot be derived from the other. The Iyashmin and Gabi Pesach, maybe we're going to be machmir in the case of Pesach. And we're going to throw the books at him and say, why didn't you do this preparation before Pesach? We're not going to allow you to do it on Shabbos. You should have done it before Shabbos. Awesome. Who the mכשירי mitzvah lo dochi? Why aren't we going to allow him to override mכשירי mitzvah since he could have done it on Erev Shabbos? Mishum delo nichrasu aleh shloshes brisos. It's not on the same level as Milah. The Torah repeats itself 13 times in the parsha of Bris Milah, in Brachos Perek Yud Zayin, the mitzvah that was given to Avram Avinu, 13 brisos. Is Ema Lidche, maybe here Rabbi Akiva, or shall we say, will reject Rabbi Akiva in favor of Shloshei brisos and allow for violating the Shabbos with a mכשיrim that could have been done on Erev Shabbos. The Iyashme'in on Milah, if you had told me in the case of Milah that we pass in Rabbi Akiva Chosam, who the mכשיrim mitzvah lo dochu Shabbos the leka kares, nobody's going to be chayiv kares because the baby is only 8 days old. You can't say he's chayiv kares, and the father's not chayiv kares. Is avo Pesach kares, but if we don't check the Korban Pesach on Yudal B'Nisan on behalf of this individual, he's chayiv kares. Is ema, maybe we would say that in such a case, mכשיri mitzvah, mכשיri korban, even though they could have been done yesterday, litche, we should be docha Shabbos. Tzricha, therefore we need both cases. And now we begin the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Samates of the base. This is the Mishnah of Korban Chagiga. The Gemara is going to wonder why until now we haven't been discussing Korban Chagiga, and all of a sudden the Mishnah changes its theme to Korban Chagiga. And what we're going to see is that there's a machlokas tanoim with regard to the Korban Chagiga, what's called the Chagigas Arbas. And one school of thought in the Tanoim is going to assume that we derive from drashos in the Psukim that the Torah commands us on Erev Pesach to bring a Korban Chagiga together with the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. Other Tanoim say that no, we don't derive that from the Psukim, it's only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And now the Mishnah is going to address in what cases would they bring a Korban Chagiga and for what purpose on Yudalit if you don't derive from Psukim. So the Mishnah says, Emasai maybe Chagiga Ima. When do we require him to bring a Korban Chagiga together with his Korban Pesach? And the answer is Bizman Shuba Bachol, only if the 14th of Nisan is on a weekday. In other words, Korban Chagiga, even if it's a mitzvah, it doesn't have the same status as Korban Pesach, and it doesn't override the Shabbos. Bitara. So in other words, if they brought the Korban Pesach Bitara, then we could override the Shabbos, but we would not override the Shabbos for the sake of the Korban Chagiga. And furthermore, when are we obligated to bring the Korban Chagiga? We have another condition, and that is ubemuat. Now, in order to appreciate that word ubemuat, we have to know a little bit more about the Korban Pesach and the mitzvah achila. And the halacha is that we need to eat Korban Pesach al hasova. That's when we eat the afikomen zeichel Korban Pesach at the end of the meal. That's considered more of a cover for the Korban Pesach. We're not starving and we have to rip it apart, eat that meat fast because we're famished. No, we eat it at the end of the meal like b'nei malach. So there's a kiyum of ala sofa. Some say it's in all karbanos. There's a kiyum of achila ala sofa. But anyway, so now he needs something to fill his body so that then he can eat the Korban Pesach at the end of the meal ala sofa. Now, if, for example, the number of people registered in the Korban Pesach is relatively small, so each person is only going to get a small piece of meat, the kazayis botzim in a Pesach, how is he going to fill up his body so that he eats that kazayis achrona al hasova? We're going to eat the chagiga, the basar chagiga. That's called b'muat. Muat means there are very few people in the chabura, and therefore, in order to fill his body up, his belly up, we bring the korban chagiga. Now, however, if the 14th of Nisan coincides with Shabbos, or there are plenty of people in the Chabura, and we know that he's going to be able to eat alasova, and then the Mishnah says ubetum. If let's say rov hatzibur atmeim or rov hakohanim atmeim is ein meviim imo chagiga, because chagiga is not powerful enough to be docha Shabbos or to be docha tuma. And if it's meruba, then we don't need it. And the Mishnah continues and says, "Chagiga shahoisa ba min atzonim min abakim min akvasim min aizim min azchorim min akevis min acheles l'shnei yomim v'laylecha." These are other dinim that apply to Korban Pesach. And now the Gemara asks the obvious question: my tana de ketani chagiga. I mean, in all the Mishnayos that we've had until now, we've been dealing with the laws of Korban Pesach exclusively. Well, why did this Mishnah choose to wedge in a discussion about the chagiga? And the Gemara answers, the Tana of our Mishnah mentioned harkavasa, b'ava'asa, the lodachi Shabbos. Once we were listing situations where you cannot override the Shabbos, for example, mכשירי Pesach, which could have been done on Erev Shabbos, like havasa mechutz tchum, or as we discussed about cutting off the abeles. So once you've gone into that area of, what we're not allowed to do on Shabbos of Erev Pesach is memela katani nami chagiga delodachi Shabbos. Right? This is by sheer association. He goes from one to another. Here's another example of a tzarech hakarba which doesn't override the Shabbos. But it's got to be on Chol, but not on Shabbos. So Shabbos we're not going to bring it. Omer of Ashi, Shma Mina, we derive from this, Chagigas Arbasar, on the top of Daf Ayin, Lav Chovahi, the Isal Kedait Chovahi. If the Torah would obligate me to bring a Korban Chagiga, then Tesi b'Shabbos, v'Tesi b'Meruva, Tesi b'Tuma, every single Korban Chova that has a special time urgency to it, and the Torah says on the 14th you have to bring this Korban, namely this Chagiga, that would override Shabbos and Tuma. So obviously the Mishnah is maintaining that there's no Chova to bring a Korban Chagiga. The whole entity of Korban Chagiga is a Rishus. The Gemara clarifies, my timer asya. If there's no chiyuv to bring the korban chagiga, so why do we bring the chagiga? When we don't have enough people eating the korban pesach, it is tanya because we learned in the brayso chagiga that we bring a korban chagiga together with the pesach in order to guarantee that we'll be able to eat Pesach al hasova, and that's called an achila chashuva kederech ha-milach. I just want to read to you a note here about al hasova. He says that later on Daf Ayin, we're going to derive the halacha, this principle that the Pesach is nechal al hasova, means to eat it at the end of the meal when they are full, so that they really enjoy that achila. It becomes an achila chashuva kederech hamalach, because that's the way the malach and the kings will eat a piece of roasted meat at the end of the Suda, like almost like a dessert. And this is a din, says the Arzarua, that applies to all korbanos, that we should eat them kederech hamalachim, which the Gemara in Chulin derives from the fact that with regard to matnas kahuna in Bamidbar Yudches, lecha nesatim lemashcha, lemashcha means ligdula. And you'll find that Rabbi Yonasan Milunil adds that we should eat at the end so that he has a tam mutal befiv kol alayl. And also that he shouldn't be eating it an achila gas. And the Meiri explains that he should eat at the end of the meal and be satiated from it, and he will remain satiated even after his achila. Tosus later on in Daf Ayin has a slightly different explanation of the reason why we eat it ala sova. He calls the Gzeres Chachamim, because if he's too hungry, then he might come to eat even that which is around the bones, and he'll come to shviras etzem, and the Torah says we etzem lo sishberu bo. Now the Mishnah says that if the Pesach is b'muot, the Mishnah again, bisman shehu b'muot, that b'sara shal Pesach muot, there's very little basar Pesach to be masbia the bnei chabura. So that would mean that they need the chagiga at the beginning, so that when they get small amounts at the end, that will be masbia, that'll be kedei svia. But if it's b'meruba, the yeshbo harbe kedei lasbias bnei chabura. Let's say, I guess if it's a smaller chabura, therefore each person will get a larger portion of the Korban Pesach, such that now, right? So meruba means that the volume of Pesach is meruba because the number of bnei chabura is mu'at. Let's get that reverse. Okay, then. So we're going to stop here on the top of Daf Ayin Amud Aleph. And we're up to V'necheles l'shnei yomim v'layla ech.